We are presenting to you a session called The Game of SharePoint Migrations, Winter is Coming. I'm Tom Duff, and
I'm Sandra Mahan.
Yeah,
thanks
very
for
good.
joining us.
I'm glad we have that whole thing going on. The slide that you see right now is the fact that SharePoint Conference used to be the name of everything. It's actually now changing its name to the Microsoft 365 whatever, because there you go. She's running the slides. I get to talk and tell her when to move, but it's now become the Microsoft 365 Collaboration Conference. So that's going to be in March at hopefully live if COVID cooperates, and look forward to seeing you there. I'm hoping I get a chance to actually go to that one because I really enjoy that conference, but we'll find out. So with that, let's go to the next one. Here's all the sponsors who are making this all happen over the 36 hours of this event. We thank you very much, because without you, we wouldn't be able to do this. So definitely go out and support the sponsors. There's also a raffle for an Oculus Quest, actually 3 of them. So go ahead, visit the vendor booth, sessions, watch the videos. There's answers to submit the raffles. There's a link there. Go ahead and take care of that. Plus, if you would like to donate anything in terms of charity relief funds, United Way and International Medical Corps are the 2 organizations that we are promoting in this particular event and trying to raise money. And with that, now we're, oh gosh, Sandra, you don't have the Game of Thrones font.
Well, look at that. Yeah, it kept showing up when I was looking at them previously, and my slides like automatically advancing. I didn't even hit that last button, so.
Wow.
Oh well, it's all good.
Yeah, we'll get around. Normally you would see true Game of Thrones font here. We have that really set up nicely, but then we switched to her doing it instead of me. So anyway, Game of Thrones migration. Let's go ahead and introduce ourselves. My name is Tom Duff. On Twitter, you can find me on Duffbird. I also do tips and tricks for oneminuteofficemagic.com. So if you ever want to see any Office 365, Microsoft 365 tips, feel free to go out there. And my email is listed there. And Sandra?
Yeah, I'm Sandra Mahan, work for a company here in Portland, Oregon. I don't have a blog. I just kind of feed Tom information. And,
and it works really, really well because she finds really cool stuff. And just so you know, the whole size differential that you see there, that was actually to scale pretty much. I'm on the short side. She is on the taller side, which is hence why we have this particular slide in there, because it made a whole lot of sense. So with that, let's go ahead and talk about what we're going to cover in this story. We're going to talk about the current home. That's our SharePoint 2010 environment that we started with. Then we'll talk about what our plans were and where we were basically heading with everything. We'll talk about our alliances, who was basically helping us get everything set up and running. We'll talk about the training that we had on this, because there were a lot of things in terms of going to SharePoint Online that people had to be trained for. We'll cover what we used to get there. Then we'll go into some detail on what we did for our migration. And after we go through the migration and we show you what kind of communication we had, things like that, we'll also talk about our pitfalls, the things that we learned along the way that kind of scared us once we finally figured out what was going on. But hopefully that if you find yourself in the same situation, these will be things that you can look at and not have it hit you as a surprise. And then finally, we'll talk about our new home, which is our full migration to SharePoint Online. So with that, this is our current home, SharePoint 2010. It's looking really dingy. We started trying to migrate to SharePoint 2013, and it kept getting put in the budget each year. It kept getting taken out of the budget each year. And unfortunately, we got to a situation where with SharePoint 2010, then SharePoint 2013 was available. And then once SharePoint 2013 phased into SharePoint 2016, we're like, now we're looking at 2 migrations to get back up to speed. And finally, we thought, we just need to bite the bullet and go to Office 365 and forget all this migration stuff on a regular basis. Let's just go ahead and get everything out there and let's go for it. So in 2017, we started turning on some of the Office 365 features, so Exchange, Office Pro Plus, things like that. And then what happened is in 2019, we targeted that year for doing the whole SharePoint Online migration. We started in about April of that year when we got our vendor on board and we started to scope everything out. Unfortunately, it's been said that we had an 18-month project that we only had about 9 months to pull off. Because for those of you who might find yourself in the SharePoint 2010 world, the Windows 8 servers had to be turned off by what was it, January 20th, I believe, of 2020. Yeah,
I think that was our date. So
yeah, or else we were going to get hit with like $2 or $3 million worth of extended support. So our management was like, you will be done by the end of the year. And we're looking at this massive project with there was 3 of us on the SharePoint team, but Sandra and I were doing a lot of the heavy loads of what we're going to cover in terms of what we did on a week in, week out basis. But we had 3,300 sites and subsites that existed in our SharePoint 2010 environment, which we originally converted to back in 2009. So we had a lot of things that were old, were not necessary, were broken. Mm-hmm. And so the Christmas of 2019, I went through and started trying to pick off some of the low-hanging fruit of things that didn't have anything in them, they looked broken, and we decided to go with a very flat structure. We weren't going to do subsites anymore. So everything that was a site or a subsite was going to have its own site collection within the SharePoint Online environment. So you want to go ahead and pop over one there, Sandra? So our plans. We took all the sites that we had out there, and it ended up being, I think, like 1,800 sites that we ended up migrating. We were able to delete a number of sites as we went along, both sites that we looked at and said, nah, these really don't have any relevance anymore, or ones where the people go, wow, I didn't know that still existed, go ahead and delete it. So we divided those into weekly groups, kind of working back from, if we have to be done by 12/31, how many weeks do we have to do these? And of course, we started with, okay, week 1 is only going to have maybe like 10 or 15 sites that we're migrating so we could kind of get our feet wet. And then when we got into the September, October, November range, some weeks we had like 150 sites that we were migrating, and those were pretty wicked in terms of the amount of workload that we had there.
Well, and we tried to keep it to about 100 sites a week, right, Tom?
That was our goal. In most cases, it probably averaged out to that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was, some weeks were really big because what we were trying to do is we were trying to keep similar sites. So if you had like a main subsite or a main site and then you had a bunch of subsites underneath it, we tried to keep all of those like in one migration cycle because we didn't want people having all the sites that they normally use in a site collection with subsites and stuff moving at different times, because that was going to make it even harder for them. And of course, being that we're moving to SharePoint Online, all our links are going to break, which that was another fun thing for people. So, oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No, I was just moving my headset.
Oh, okay. So that was kind of the goal that we had in mind. We had everything in a spreadsheet, but what Sandra did is she took all that information and put it into a SharePoint Online list with all the SharePoint 2010 sites, with all the information in terms of what cycle they were going to go in, what the dates were that they were going to be going, who the site owners were. And really, because many of these sites hadn't been touched in years, they may have 10 people listed as quote unquote owners, but 8 or 9 of them may no longer be with the company. So we had to look at each one of these sites beforehand to find the owners or designate who we think are owners. And then we also had to build out a projected name of the new site and a URL for the new site, because our vendor, when they went to do the migration, they were going to want to say, okay, here's the old site and the URL, here's the new site that it's going to be named, and here's the new URL that we're going to use. So we had to have all that done beforehand, and there was really no way that we could let things kind of self-generate the names, because we'd have a lot of duplicate names, they'd overlay each other, it wouldn't have been a good thing. So I spent, God, what, about a month and a half going through all these things, trying to get everything prepped and ready to go. That was work that was rather laborious, but it was time well spent. We were able to get a lot of things taken care of, and it ended up being one of our success factors in what we did. So our alliances. With our alliances, we picked a vendor who was going to help us with the migration. And in this particular case, the vendor was primarily responsible for running the ShareGate migration tool from like Friday night through Sunday to get the number of sites that we had for any particular week. If we had spent more money, and in hindsight, we might have wanted to, we probably would have been able to spare Sandra and myself a lot of effort and time that we spent on the weekends, because we were working like 50 and 60-hour weeks on a pretty regular basis, checking things out, things that we'll discuss a little bit later. But that was pretty much on us. So while the cost of our migration from the vendor that we had was not as expensive as many of the other vendors, we also had to do a lot of the heavy pulling ourselves on the team. And in hindsight, that was probably too much work for us to be doing for only 2 people doing most of the week in, week out stuff. But I presented this live at a user group meeting, and there was a project manager talking about migrations right after I presented. And during her presentation, she looked at me and said, "If I was your project manager, I would be really worried about you." I'm looking at her going, yeah, I was kind of worried about myself too. But those were some of the things that we did. We did have a vendor to help. I don't think we could have done this on our own, because we didn't know what we didn't know. And so by having a vendor who had done this before, we were able to get heads up on certain things. And from that perspective, it made it easier in the fact that we had some expert advice that we could go with. But there were a lot of things we had to figure out on our own, because we had such a large backlog of old stuff that had been around forever and worked in various levels. So let's go ahead and
Okay.
the next slide. Training was yours. This is where you take it.
Yep. So I think this comes over to me. So one of the things that we did is we knew that we needed to do this huge migration, but also to train our users, because as Tom mentioned, we went from SharePoint 2010 to SharePoint Online. So what, 9 years of technology improvements since we went live originally? So
yeah, our environment was showing its age.
oh, definitely. And when you have your environment showing its age like that, you get a lot of shadow IT. People are like, oh, SharePoint 2010 can't do this, so I'm going to bring in another technology. So it was really good for us to finally get up to SharePoint Online and have that automatic update, so we could always provide the best for our employees. So one of the things we had to do, because that was such a huge skill gap for employees moving up to SharePoint Online, we offered a lot of training available for them. So we actually partnered with Brainstorm. They were a company that offered on-demand webinars and skill paths through their quick help portal. And also we paid a little bit of extra to actually do some instructor-led training. And so we did this from June to October. As Tom mentioned, we started in April with our migration process, just to kind of understand what that migration was going to look like. And as people started moving over, because it was a gradual migration, we offered the training sessions, every other week through that time period, so that as new groups of users came on board, they would still have that training available. Because if you train them all in April, by the time they get migrated over in, let's say, September, they're not going to remember what they learned. So that's why we had to make sure we had a lot of that training available.
And this is really something that I would like to emphasize, that do not skimp on training. Any money that you spend on training will pay for itself multiple times over the back end. This was one of the first projects I think we did where we had a specific person who was focused just on user adoption and training. It made our life so much easier. and I don't think it would have been nearly as successful if she had not been part of the team.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Well, and so we only had about 292 people that attended the training, which was probably fine because most of those users were our power users, our site owner kind of folks, site administrators. So it was good for them to attend the training. And as they continue to migrate their content and learn more about the systems, they could always come back and take additional training. So it was really nice to spread that over a long period of time. And our attendance rate was 81% of those people that had signed up actually attended the training, which was great. Some of our other training resources that we did, we had Spark Connect, which Spark is the name of our intranet portal for all of our employees to go to. So Spark Connect, we just designated these as open office hours. We've been doing this for how many years, Tom? 5?
Gosh, 5, 6, somewhere around there, yeah.
Yeah, so we just have every 2 weeks, we have an hour-long session where people can come in and ask all sorts of questions, or if there's new technology that we want to train them on, we talk about that there. We also have Spark One, which is our twice-a-week newsletter. We've got 1,000 people. Our company is about 5,500 employees, and we have about 1,000 employees that have actually subscribed to this newsletter to learn more. So it's a great resource. Tom put a link in here for his 1-minute office magic. So everything that he posts in Spark One also gets posted there. So externally, if you guys need a resource that's just kind of, these are just really short tips and tricks that should only take just a minute to read and gives you some good information. And we're not developers by any means, so it's pretty easy stuff to gain. The last thing that we did was Content Panda, which offers in-context help. And so if you turn it on, there's a little panda that appears on your screen and you can get training based on whatever you're trying to do on there. So a really affordable application for us for the training piece. So as far as our migration, Tom had mentioned we took our Excel spreadsheet of all the SharePoint 2010 sites that we had. We put it onto a SharePoint Online site. We had our migration list, but we also made this kind of our main portal for anybody that was going through the migration with us, all of our site owners, site administrators, of how to actually work with the site. We had a frequently asked questions, best practices, here's the different roles of what the people are going to be doing. Here's where we're at with our migration. How many sites were deleted or decommissioned? How many have been migrated? How many did we have left? We had our countdown timer, like when is it coming out or when are we going to end?
Boy, that was terrifying to watch on a daily basis.
Oh, yes. Heck yeah.
You've got 14 more days.
Before the system explodes. We should have put like a bomb right there or something. No, I'm just kidding. So then we also listed, like, we use Remedy for our incident tracking. So we had a spot here for them to get to those common Remedy requests. And then we had links back to that quick help training offered by Brainstorm. So we offered a lot of resources on our migration site. We also did a lot of communications one-to-one with the site owners that were going to be migrating during that time period. So our migration cycle, and this is how we accomplished it. I'm not saying that this is the best tried and true method and will make you successful in every effort, but just to kind of give you some stuff to reference in the future if you are going through a similar migration. So we went through and we said, okay, we're T- 2 weeks out, 2 weeks before we do the initial migration checkout. T-1, we let the business owners know that they have a week until their migration is going to be ready for checkout. Then we gave them a week of checkout and then go live. So theoretically, it was like a, was it 3-4 week process for them to do the migration. So we contacted them, and here's kind of what we did. As Tom mentioned, we had 29 batches. So our first batch email went out, hey, in 2 weeks, your site is going to do an initial migration, or going to be migrated. So 2 weeks out, we sent them an initial email, or the T-2 week email. Then we did the initial migration email. And then T-1 week email. Here's when we want you to begin your site owner checkout. We gave them 1 week to do the site owner checkout. Go in, take a look at it, make sure everything looks good, update your links, because as Tom mentioned, all of our links broke, which was not fun. And then we would do a Delta migration on the Friday after we have them complete their or actually we did the Delta migration on Saturday. We had them do the checkout Monday through Friday. And then that Sunday, we went in and we went through and we locked down the old sites and made them read-only on our 2010 environment. So nobody could add any new contents because we didn't want to have to do another Delta migration. And then they'd go live that following Monday.
Yeah, and to be realistic here, to say, you mean to tell me you only gave your people a week to check things out? I will be the first one to admit that was not enough time for them to do it properly. Especially since even though you need to communicate early and often, sometimes we'd send the stuff out, they wouldn't see it or they ignore it. But because we were under such a heavy deadline to this needs to be done by the end of the year, we kind of had to go, yeah, I realize this isn't optimal. I'm really sorry. Here's what's going to happen. And we did. If they said, oh, I'm sorry, but we're like really, really busy, and we maybe had them in cycle 8, but they were all going to be gone during that week, or that was something business-wise that they couldn't really accommodate, we were saying, okay, fine, we'll move you to, say, group 15. And they're like, yeah, that would work better. So we did try to accommodate those things, but by and large, once we started them into the cycle, it's like, you're going to have to go live, and I'm sorry this is going to hurt, and I'm sorry it's going to be painful, but this is what we need to do as the business. So,
yeah, well, and as Tom mentioned, so we theoretically gave them 1 week to do the checkout. Honestly, really, they had 2 weeks because we did the initial migration on April 26th, and so they could have started checking it out there. So there was a little bit longer of a time period, but we really expected them to go in and heavily use the system between that 1 week period and let us know if there's any changes.
Yeah, and we did have a couple special groups that knew that they weren't going to be able to do everything within 1 week because they had sites that spanned many, many other sites and the whole bit. We kind of had to almost set them up as their own special group. And they had like 3 or 4 months to do everything. It was kind of hard to keep all that going because some of the things worked well, some of the things didn't. We were able to migrate most of the sites, but other ones didn't. That was a little hard to do, but by and large, we tried to stay with this particular cycle for the ones we had designated for that particular week.
Yeah, perfect. So I just kind of want to run through kind of what we sent out as our communications. Our slide deck has all this in it. So if you need to reference this and want to kind of copy a little bit of what we did, feel free. So again, T-minus 2 weeks, 2 weeks before they go live, we would send out an email that would say, hey, we're getting ready to do your migration. Here's information, here's training resources for you, here's things that you should do, here's things you shouldn't do, here's the expectation during that time period, and then ongoing communication. And they could share this with the rest of their team to let them know, hey, this is coming up. And again, your initial migration is going to happen on this coming Saturday. So we'd send this email out on Monday and say your initial migration is going to happen on Saturday. We don't want you to delete any data after we do the initial migration because it's not going to carry over to the new site. Don't delete your SharePoint site on your own. Let us know so that we can take care of deleting that and mark it off our list. Then T-minus 1 week, we would send this out to let them know, again, we're expecting you to do a checkout next week. Get ready for this. Here's the things you need to do. Again, here's your next steps. Take a look at your homepage on the new site. Do you need to do some different things there? Look at the item counts. So go into site contents. Are the page numbers the same as what they were on the old site? Or, the page counts? Are the document libraries matching up? That was kind of our first line of defense to make sure that everything had migrated over successfully. If there's review site permissions, because since we went to a flat structure, some of the hierarchy with the migration over did not carry over effectively for the inherited parent site permissions. So we had to go in and update some of those permissions as well. Any of the info path forms, we had to republish. We couldn't just let them come over. Some of them worked okay. Some of them just had to be republished. Same with SharePoint Designer workflows. We needed to make sure and update those if they needed to be pointed to a different URL path. And then we'd go in and we'd mark the status. Hey, it's ready for checkout. So we always knew where we're at on things. Tom, did you want to mention something, or?
We've got a couple questions out there, but once you get done with this particular section, then we'll go ahead and answer some of the questions we've got pending.
Okay. Break. Sounds good. Site owner checkout. Again, this was week 3. This is the email that we sent out. Here's some of the instructions that we provided. Using one of the new modern SharePoint pages, we expect you to go to your site. Here's reference materials. Here's how to check the links on the navigation. Here's how to look at site contents. Do the counts match? Take a look at any custom lists and forms. And here's some recommendations. So again, we try to guide them as much as possible. Then we would do a site lockdown. So we were going to do the Delta migration. So anything that had changed from the initial migration to this now point in time, 2 weeks later, we're going to go ahead and do a Delta migration. The next morning we go in and lock it down. And when we lock down the site, what we would do is go out to the SharePoint 2010 site and we'd add a banner to the homepage that says, hey, this SharePoint site has moved. It's in a read-only status. We removed it from search. Here's a link, and update your bookmarks and links accordingly. This was a really important thing for people to know, hey, I've gone out to the site. My OneNote doesn't work anymore, or I can't upload a document because people don't read emails. Shocker. I know. Everybody's surprised. Emails. So we'd go in and we'd change all the site permissions. We'd mark it all read so they could still get to the content. If there was something that didn't get picked up, they could bring it over, but they couldn't add any new content on SharePoint 2010. Then we'd go in and remove the site owners from the site collection admins. That way they couldn't go out there and change it back from read-only to contribute access. Didn't want them to do that. Well, we wanted that. Yeah. We went in and removed it from search because we didn't want people to continue to find that old content when it had been moved. And then if it's a site collection, we didn't do this one very.
It was a cool idea, but it's like we removed everybody from the search admins and we locked everything down to read. We didn't need to go out to central admin and do the change to read only because we had pretty much locked it down. But in a case where you had a large site and you wanted to be triply sure that nobody was going to be able to add anything into it, you could do the central admin technique there. Yeah,
and the reason that we really didn't do this is because, again, we had so many subsites and subsites and subsets. So yeah, if you lock it down on that site collection, it locks everything down. So by doing it site by site, it worked the best for us. So then finally, when Monday rolled around, we'd send out that final email that says, hey, you're now live. We gave them an email template that said, hey, we can send this out to our team. So we sent one out to the site owners that we had identified early on. And then we provided them with a link to say, hey, as a site member or contributor, here's the things that you need to know. And here's some training for you as well. So that was kind of the path we went through there. So on to our pitfalls. I know this is your area, Tom. So
yeah, let's go ahead and address some of the
some
of the questions we have out there before we go on to the next slide. Dave said, you mentioned links were broken. Were you referring to links on pages that were pointed to on-prem for a site that also migrated? Basically, what we were in a situation of was for our SharePoint 2010 environment, everything was spark.companyname.com/site/apps/whatever. When we moved to SharePoint Online, everything became companyname.sharepoint.com. And you also mentioned you think you can map links to new links during migration. Do you know if that's correct? We talked about that, and that wasn't necessarily Sandra and I's area, but what they found was trying to do that linkage there because the URLs were going to be different, even if it was just that front part that changed. We found that it really wasn't going to be effective for us to go through and try to automatically route people to a new URL. So yeah, it wasn't necessarily things that were pointing to on-prem that were broken because those weren't changing. It's just that content wasn't going to be used anymore. All the content had been migrated to SharePoint Online. Those links had been changed. And so people, if they had like left side navigation that had different lists and libraries and stuff like that. Sometimes ShareGate does a really good job at picking up what that new URL is going to be. Other times, not so much, especially if it was going to a different site altogether. So those really need to be looked at. I think we're still cleaning up some of those. People,
right.
oh, my links don't work. It's like, yeah, they haven't worked now for about 8 months, but we help them with that one. Somebody mentioned, I don't think a week, as you said, is realistic. We would so agree with you on that one. And also, Sally said, it's a good session, thanks, but a week is just reasonable in most UK businesses, particularly pharmaceuticals. It would be more like 3 months. What would be your advice on this? In our case, had we not been up against the 12/31 deadline and the extended support, yeah, this would have been like an 18 to 24 month project, and we would have definitely built in more checkout time, and it would have been much more helpful to everybody in that particular case. You know, my attitude was, oh, it's going to cost you $2 million for extended support if we go past January 20th, 2020. I think you better start budgeting for extended support at that date. That didn't go over really well with our management. But yeah, we were in a situation where it was a rock and a hard spot. I think if we were dealing with like pharmaceutical that you talked about there would have been a situation where we just couldn't have done it within that time frame. You know, legally, it would not have been allowed. The business would have suffered. So we just have to say, yep, sorry, it's going to take 2 years to do this. I really wished we had had that time because it would have been a cleaner migration. But unfortunately, we just didn't have that that option, being how management wanted it to get done. Maybe we'll cover this later, but how did you handle permissions, especially unique permissions on folder and items, workflows, pages, features, and web parts migration? Document migrations, I know, are pretty straightforward. Yeah, we had a lot of fun with all those items. We're going to talk about actually a couple of them in pitfalls here coming up. But in many cases, the unique permissions came over okay, and we were fine with that. We did have a few custom web parts that we had in our 2010 environment. Those didn't come over, so it's like, yeah, you're going to have to figure out some other way to do it. So like we had a custom announcements web part that formatted things real nicely, but that wasn't going to come across because we didn't want to have any custom coding. So that was like, no, that's just pretty much going to be a web part that you're going to have to do a list web part, and that's going to be your announcements. So there were some trade-offs there that were not optimal, but again, because of the constraints that we were under, we had to make those particular scenarios. I'll also mention something about workflows in the pitfalls area. We had some workflows that had profile information that it would pick up. That didn't exist in SharePoint 2013 because, or I'm sorry, SharePoint Designer 2013, because that's what we had to start using for our thing going forward. So yeah, we had to go through and redo some of our workflows to do profile information differently. We also found that on InfoPath, when we would use the get user profile by name web part. Well, in InfoPath, it doesn't support web calls in SharePoint Online. So all the ones where we'd say, hey, put in the person's employee number and poof, here comes all their profile information, none of that worked in InfoPath anymore. So we had to go through and actually build Power Automate flows to pick up that information using HTTP calls and stuff like that. It was a lot more complex. That was something we didn't find out until we were midstream on our migration. And it was kind of like, what are we going to do? And so, yeah, we kind of had to do that one on the fly. It was not fun. Let me see here. It appears that you migrated to classic sites, or did you do some migrations to modern sites? We did have some people who chose to rebuild their sites from scratch using modern. And if they did that, we would move over their list and or libraries that they wanted to bring over. But by and large, when we were doing the standard migration, we would create a classic team site in SharePoint Online, and that's what we'd migrate to. So it was kind of a migration of like to like. In some ways, yeah, it would have been nice to go straight to modern and make everything nice and clean and pretty. But again, the time constraints were giving us a problem. Plus, being that when we were copying things over to a classic team site, they were still kind of familiar with that. So there was a little bit of comfort in the fact that they weren't seeing a lot of things change on them.
And Tom, with that migration, wasn't that something that our vendor had put into the PowerShell script? So by you providing the URL path, his script automatically created that classic team site as part of the PowerShell script and then migrated the content, right?
Yeah, it was, he was doing, while we were using ShareGate to do the migration, he was able to script that because basically ShareGate behind the scenes is doing PowerShell scripts. And so he would set up a script that would go through and create all our sites that we were moving everything to. And then he would run a second script that would start copying over all the data, and that would take anywhere from 18 to 36 hours. So yeah, there was a lot of stuff going on the weekend, but we were really, again, time constraints. I know I keep harping on that, but it was like, yeah, we're going to have to go like to make this happen in the time frame that we've got. We've now had some people go through. We do a lot of things with, like, people go, oh, I want a different home page. Sandra can give them a really bright, happy, sunny home page like within 5 minutes that's modern, and they're like, oh my God, this is so awesome. So it's easy for us to now go through and start cleaning things up. But again, we are fully understanding of the fact we have a lot of technical debt that we're going to have to address over the next 2 to 4 years. But that's what we had to do to make it happen in the time frame. Where do we get the slide decks? I think all that's going to be available from the people who are doing the virtual marathon thing. You should get that information. So keep an eye open for that in an email. Just the site URL parent changed as well. Yeah, it did. All of them changed. Were you able to easily migrate InfoPath form services forms that had a lot of complex rules and data connections? No, by and large, no.
And we didn't do any coding, really, so to speak, in our InfoPath forms. We left them pretty basic, but there were data connections and rules. But most of those migrated over fine, didn't they, Tom, just once after we republished them?
Yeah, by and large they would, but again, the ones that were grabbing profile information, we had to kind of handle those and do the Power Automate calls that would go get that information. So instead of all the profile information being put in at the time they entered the form, they would just enter their R number, save it, and then the flow would trigger on the back end and bring in department, division, stuff like that. So it's a different way to think of things. Real quick, a couple more questions and we'll get back to the slides here. Did you allow teams to build their own SharePoint communication sites, or did you create and migrate for all other teams? We basically asked them to go through and submit a help desk case because we didn't want a lot of people creating sites which were like, test one, test two, and they're like, we wouldn't do that. It's like, yeah, you would.
we saw it when we migrated your sites and deleted a bunch of them because they were called test.
So yeah, we basically do it for them just to have some level of governance there at this stage of game. That may change later on down the road, but that's where we're at right now. And how did you handle site collections that still had files checked out? Oh yeah, we're going to talk about that one in these slides right here.
Yeah.
Do you have a recommendation on how to speed up migrations with ShareGate? They've got something called Insane Mode, which actually copies it out to an Azure data storage area, and then it inputs from there.
And don't you have to have it installed on a server? It can't be on your desktop, if I remember right.
Exactly. Yeah. It's done on the server. You can use Insane Mode. That helps. I know our vendors were like basically balancing how much load was being put on SQL servers and stuff like that. By and large, we moved a whole lot of data in weekends, more than I thought we'd be able to. But that was kind of their end, and we didn't have to deal with that on a regular basis.
Yeah. So Tom, do you want to jump back to the slides? Because I know we're getting close on the...
Yeah, that was the last of the questions too. So.
Okay.
So yeah, pitfalls. The night is dark and full of terror. She came up with that one. I really liked that one as our slide. PHI and Active Directory, because we work for an insurance firm, personal health information is really critical to us. So any sites that were flagged as having PHI, instead of using SharePoint permission groups, we had to go with Active Directory groups. That was a pain in the butt, still is, because people can't update their own Active Directory groups. They have to fill out help desk cases to do that. And so they went from being able to update their own permissions in a matter of seconds to sometimes waiting 3, 4, 5 days. That's still something we're living with. The speed's getting better, but yeah, I wish we hadn't had to do that. But in order for InfoSec to say, yeah, you're okay, we've got PHI secured, that's what we had to do. Sandra alluded to the fact that people don't read emails. We had one person who complained about the fact when they went live, they're like, you didn't train us, put us back. And we're like, no. You didn't tell us about this. Yeah, we did. We actually sent you specifically 4 emails. I didn't think those applied to me. Okay. That particular person doesn't talk to me anymore, but that's okay. Yeah, no matter how much you communicate, there's still going to be people who don't read it, but you really have to over communicate. Document library files with no initial check-in. That was the bane of our existence. We didn't discover that till about 3 or 4 weeks in, where we realized that certain things were not moving over to the new site because there was no version 1.0 that had ever been checked in. So as part of my process, I tried to stay about 2 weeks ahead of the migration cycle. I would go into each site, each document library that was out there, check and see if there were any documents that had not been checked in, and then I would check them in. That was a lot of work, that was a pain, and there was no other way around it. So you have to be aware of that one and make sure that you're trying to cover it. InfoPath in SharePoint Online does not support web service calls. I think we talked about that for profile information. This is probably a really good reason why people tell you get off InfoPath. Unfortunately, we liked our InfoPath. So we're still now starting to work towards migrating away from InfoPath, but that was one of those things that we unfortunately got hit with that we had to make some change. And SharePoint Designer 2013 does not have an option to get user profile information like we did in SharePoint Designer 2010. Again, we've had to kind of work around that and use Power Automate flows to get that information, which fits in with us wanting to get rid of SharePoint Designer anyway, but that was kind of one of those things that we just were building up some technical debt that we had to address. Why don't we go to the next slide? Permission groups are often empty for subsites. This was not a lot of fun, and I still don't think I fully understand exactly how and why this happened. But when we had subsites that were inheriting permissions from a parent site, a lot of the SharePoint permission groups that we had, the permission group would come down, but they would come down empty. And so when we would go in and say, hey, you're live, people are like, I can't get into my site. We check the permission groups and they're completely empty, even though in the parent site you had all the names. We had to go through and check permissions on every single site at the end of each week for our migrations and make sure the permission groups were there. Again, that made no sense to me, but apparently that's the way that it had to be done. So that was something that we had to, it caused us a lot of hours of work. Long hours for our SharePoint team. Yeah, Sandra and I were working 50, 60 hours a week, week in, week out. We were both really ready for vacations when the end of January came around. Mm-hmm. Difficulty in making sure we divide and conquer incoming emails. Rather than try to do a list or have people ask questions and stuff like that, we just went with email. That probably wasn't optimal in hindsight, but it was what people were used to, and we were trying to make it as easy as possible for them. Yeah, we had a ton of emails, but Sandra and I usually had things where I would take emails from 8 in the morning or 5 in the morning till noon. She'd take it from noon on for the rest of the day. Generally speaking, we kept up pretty well on things. SharePoint Online doesn't support incoming emails on list and libraries. We had a number of sites that did use that feature to where they could email a document library in SharePoint 2010. That doesn't happen in SharePoint Online. You did a Power Automate workflow that's kind of simulates that.
Yeah, so what we ended up doing, because again, it's just not supported. So we built a shared mailbox in Exchange so people could email directly into there. And then with a Power Automate, we said, okay, if it's coming from this location and it has this subject line in it, put it out here on the SharePoint site. And that's how we got around it. We just use one common shared mailbox for all of those incoming emails, and it just drops it into the library just like they used to have before. So.
And certain business areas need longer ramp up times. That's one of those things that you're going to have to accommodate. You know, some areas can do it in a week because all they have is document library out there. They really don't care.
HR was ours.
HR was ours. They had like a 4 to 5 month time. So it's like, but yeah, that was a lot of fun. In our new home, I think this one was yours.
Yes, it is.
Go for it.
So we'll try to wrap through this really quick and get back to questions here. But we ended up decommissioning over 1,800 sites. So way more than half. If you had told Tom this in April when we first started, he would not have believed it. I was like, yes, we can do this. No, I'm just kidding. So again, a lot of these were because we allowed site owners to create their own sites and subsites. We had a lot of test and Barbara's site and Barbara's no longer here and all that crap that just kind of proliferates in your environment. So we have locked down our environment in SharePoint Online to only allow us to create sites and subsites. Same with Microsoft Teams. We control that pretty heavily just because we don't want the proliferation that we had in SharePoint 2010. The business has been, good to help through this. We didn't have too many complaints. There were a few that were not very nice to us, but for the most part, everybody was really good. And we did a lot of surveys throughout asking how things were going. We did a retrospective at the end of it to see what we could change differently. So we've learned through the process. Hopefully we'll never have to do it again. We did have fewer migration issues than we expected. There was one that we had that did not migrate over successfully. Because it was such a business sensitive one, they asked us to move it back to SharePoint 2010. So we have one left in our SharePoint 2010 environment that they are actually moving to a new platform. It was one of those situations where just because you can build it in SharePoint may not be the reason to build it in SharePoint. So they are moving it to a different platform because it is such a complicated system. And Tom and I always joke because people come to the SharePoint team because they need a temporary solution. 6 years later, yeah,
still supporting that temporary solution.
Exactly. For the most part, everybody loves the new look and feel. The web parts on the pages, the modern look and feel is so much better, and they feel like they have a lot more control. The news web parts are great. So that is going really well for us. We're going to work on some additional themes, but we've got most of that under control. As Tom mentioned, we're learning more about Power Apps and Power Automate because we know we have to get off InfoPath eventually. We know the end of life is 2026, so we have some leverage there. SharePoint Designer 2010 workflows and SharePoint Designer 2013 workflows. We know the SharePoint Designer 2013 workflows go end of life in October. So we are actively tracking these right now and getting those on Power Automate. And let's see, refresh and review business apps to incorporate. Yeah, so we're working on that as we kind of clean up our InfoPath stuff so that we can make them look better and, kind of work from there. So that is where we are at.
And it's, when we presented this in the SharePoint Saturday Twin Cities, she actually flew out. I'm based in Minneapolis. She actually flew out from Portland. We presented together. I was actually in a Jon Snow cape, long wig, and big old sword as a pointer. She had on a t-shirt in Game of Thrones fonts that said, "Don't make me put you on the list," which was so appropriate for so many things. And during this particular slide, I pulled out a bottle of honey whiskey and we took a shot in front of everybody. It's like, we deserve this. But yeah, it was very, very long. It was a very labor-intensive thing. I hope that I will never have to do something of that magnitude again in that period of time. She'll be the first one to admit, I'll be the first one to admit, I freaked out big time. I was to a point where I couldn't sleep at night. I kept getting down in my mind for the weeds, like, oh, we can't do this, we can't do this, we can't do this. It gets done. And the fact that Sandra and I work so well together, and there's no ego there, there's a ton of trust. We didn't have to worry about personalities coming into play and stuff like that. We were able to just dive in, get the work done. If she needed to take a week off, I was willing to cover. If I needed time off, she was willing to cover. And we really watched out for each other. And if we had not had that kind of working relationship, I think it would have been really, really ugly, uglier than it already was. But yeah, we did survive it. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, do we want to tackle a couple more questions here really quick? I saw somebody asked if we steered people towards Microsoft Teams in lieu of a SharePoint site. Yes, we have been. We actually went live with Teams before we went live with SharePoint Online. So we've been in Teams since 2018. I think was our date that we went live on it. Yeah. And so we've been using live events for a long time. We do have some confusion when people request a new SharePoint Teams site. They think they're getting the Teams workspace. And we've actually named it Teams Workspaces to help delineate that a little bit, because there's a SharePoint communication site, a SharePoint Teams site, and then there's Microsoft Teams Workspaces. So there is some confusion there, but we are trying to change that mentality to let people know that there's always a SharePoint site behind the Teams workspace. So we have to ask them if they specifically need chat. Did you have any issues with large lists, i.e. 50,000 plus items? Yes, we did.
The site that we had to go back on, it had well over 100,000 items that were like, I'll say transactional records. It's not transactional in the thing, but it was their workflow for the individual items they put through. And one list that was kind of like audit trail stuff had over 1.3 million records in it. Needless to say, it blew out all the totals for what Microsoft recommends, and that's probably why this didn't migrate very well. So yeah, we had some large lists that were there. We couldn't, when you're in SharePoint Online, you can't change the view threshold. So you're stuck at that 5,000 items. We've had to be very creative in how we set up views to where only 5,000 items are being displayed at a time. And that's just one of those things we had to get used to.
One thing that we have leveraged because of that 5,000 item limit is Power BI.
Yes, Sandra loves her Power BI.
I do. So
one other question I see out here. You mentioned SharePoint 2013 workflow end of life is October. What's the 2010 workflow end of life? I don't think I mentioned 2013. If I gave that impression,
I did. I said SharePoint Designer 2013, and that's Designer goes end of life in October.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Even though they've extended SharePoint 2010 support until April of 2021, the SharePoint Designer workflow thing is still 2013 or October of this year.
And one of the things we're working on right now is getting inventories of our InfoPath forms that we have out there and our SharePoint Designer workflows. Because InfoPath is really covered through 2026, and SharePoint Designer is kind of like, we can pull the plug at any time we want to, thank you. And they have, in terms of you can't do custom flows anymore in SharePoint Designer because something broke. It's like, we can't fix it. As of Saturday, it's not going to be supported anymore. We are focusing more on trying to get off of SharePoint Designer workflows as soon as we can, because we don't want to get into a situation where we find out that we've got 3 months to migrate 600 workflows. So that's kind of.
So Tom, there was one more question, and hopefully I'll just throw this in here really quick. Somebody asked about updating links manually. So yes, on the SharePoint sites, you do have to update them manually. One thing we found was that if you have a document that has a bunch of links in the document and you need to update all those links, I think it was a function called Control-H will expose all the hyperlinks on a Word document. Then you can do a find and replace all those URL paths. So that was a huge win for a bunch of people that had Word documents that had those hyperlinks. So I think it's Control-H. Tom, you might know better.
I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay, with that, I think we answered all the questions out there, Tom.
And 5 minutes before the top of the hour, so that's not bad.
Yeah, well, thank you everyone for attending. We really appreciate it. We've got a screen up here for speaker feedback and event feedback. If you can fill those out, that would be very helpful for the organizing committee, and they've done a great job putting this together. I think they said this morning they had over 12,000 people signed up, so very impressive.
Thank you very much, everyone.